It is April of the year 711 CE. The sun rises over the coast of Algeciras in southern Spain. A Muslim army stands nervously on the beach, unsure if they will survive the battles against the Christians. Their leader walks amongst them, Tariq ibn Ziyad. His eyes turn towards the ships that carried them across the sea. Without hesitation, he orders them to be burned. Tariq then turns to his warriors. "O my warriors," he says, "where will you flee? Behind you is the ocean, and ahead of you, the enemy." So the Muslim army's only path was forward towards the conquest of Spain and history itself. In our last episode, we have left off where Uqba ibn Nafi' had established the city of Qayrawan in North Africa, but he had been ambushed and martyred by a combination of Berber and Byzantine forces. The Berbers, led by their leader Qusayla, retook Qayrawan and drove out the Arab forces, which caused Abdul Malik, the Khalifa, to send Hassan ibn Nu'man al-Ghassani, who led an army of Syrians and Berbers. These Berbers included the Luwata tribe, who were consistently allied with the Muslims. Hassan's army captured Carthage from the Byzantines and fought the Berber priestess Kahina and established himself in Qayrawan. Kahina's sons joined the Muslims alongside many Berber tribes and converted and received many of the spoils of war. Hassan ibn Nu'man was replaced by Musa ibn Nusayr. Let us now discuss the two iconic figures, Musa ibn Nusayr and Tariq ibn Ziyad. As for Musa ibn Nusayr, Musa was born in the Syrian city of Kafr Mari in 19 AH, and his father Nusayr seems to be from Ayn al-Tamr, which was under Sassanid rule until Khalid ibn al-Walid conquered it. Musa fought alongside the Umayyads against the Zubayrids, Abdullah ibn Zubayr, thus proving his loyalty to the Umayyad dynasty. Hence, when Abdul Malik consolidated Umayyad rule, he appointed his brother Bishr to govern Kufa and Basra. And it was here that Musa was appointed to an office that was related to the tax collection. In his capacity, he once again proved his honesty and his loyalty to the Umayyad dynasty. After Bishr died, Hajjaj accused Musa of embezzling some funds, keeping some of the tax money. But Abdul Aziz ibn Marwan, another of the Umayyad princes, got involved and had him released and appointed him to be in an office of his own governorship in Egypt. Abdul Aziz would go on to appoint Musa as the governor of Ifriqiya, Northern Africa, based in Qayrawan. Musa continued Hassan's policy of recruiting Berber converts, and it was he who appointed Tariq ibn Ziyad as the governor of Tangiers upon taking it. The conquest of North Africa happened with the alliance of the Berbers and the Arabs, and the importance of the Berbers increased as the conquest of North Africa progressed. In fact, the majority of troops who conquered Morocco would indeed have been of Berber origin. The Berber troops received a share of booty, but unfortunately, because of the Umayyad political tendencies, they didn't hold important positions. People like Tariq ibn Ziyad were an exception to the rule. In this time frame, the notion of wala existed, and wala was a type of status in which a non-Arab would have a contractual agreement with that Arab to be a sponsor, a mentor. And so many Berbers entered into wala agreements with the Arabs. And Tariq entered into such an agreement with Musa. So Tariq became a mawla of Musa. And in fact, the Berbers who embraced Islam, all of them became the mawali of the Arabs, who then relied on their Berber companions, the mawalis, for political ambitions. So to summarize, Musa ibn Nusayr was the governor of Qayrawan, and Tariq ibn Ziyad was underneath him as the governor, or as the mayor, if you like, of the city of Tangiers, of Tanja. Tariq was appointed by Musa over Musa's own sons, which really demonstrates the respect that Musa had for Tariq ibn Ziyad. Now, one awkward point to mention here is that much of the payments that were given to the soldiers, much of the economy was actually based upon conquest. And the reality is that conquerors, generally speaking, they fed off the war booty and the conquest, and the soldiers were then given their salary from this. They didn't have a monthly allowance. And some people have shown that this might have been an incentive for people like Tariq and Musa to then go northward and to cross over to the Iberian Peninsula. Now, while there might be an element of truth to this, in the end of the day, one cannot deny or negate the overall Islamic spirit of spreading the faith and of wanting to bring izzah to Dar al-Islam. And so the way that I personally see this is that these two types of motives are not problematic when they're combined. One can do something for the sake of Allah, and one can also do something for some worldly benefit. And if we understand this point, then much of what is happening now actually makes sense. So let us now go across the Straits of Gibraltar and take a quick look at what was happening in the Iberian Peninsula. Iberia, which is now called Spain, was one of the richest and most developed areas of the Roman Empire. It had a population of roughly 6 million people and lots of fertile land. It also had many large and developed cities. The Visigoths had dominated the Iberian Peninsula from the 5th century onwards, and their base, their capital, was in Toledo, which was somewhat central to the Iberian Peninsula. And by the time that the Muslims had arrived, due to a number of plagues and other issues, the population had probably shrunk to around 4 million people. And the larger cities now had fortified settlements and walls around them. Interestingly enough, the Visigothic kingdom actually had a rather unique system of governorship, and that was that the bishops and the nobles would all come together, and every time their king died, a new king would be elected from the nobility. It wasn't necessary that the son of the previous king become the king. And this election took place either in Toledo or in the palace of the previous king when the previous king passed away. The chief men of the state after the king were the Gothic nobles and the Hispano-Roman bishops. Nobles owned large, underexploited estates cultivated by semi-free peasants. They were the ones who provided the bulk of the army. The king had, of course, a personal royal guard, but the nobles would provide what was needed for the rest of the army when royalty summoned them. So the military owed their loyalty first to their immediate lord and then to the king. Bishops were amongst the largest landowners and the most powerful political figures of the land. This internal dynamics is important to understand because it proved to be a massive fault line that allowed the Muslims to come in and conquer the Iberian Peninsula. There was hardly any long-distance trade. Small towns and large estates were economically self-sufficient. There was barely any circulage of coinage as a trade. Most transactions were bartering. And because of the unique geography of the Iberian Peninsula, there were hardly any outside invaders for the Iberian Peninsula, with the exception of limited Byzantine incursion into various places. Iberia was basically a very large and empty and fertile land with few settlements here and there and underexploited or even neglected agricultural resources. In the very north of the peninsula, the Basque and Asturians were mountain people independent from any royal control. And by and large, throughout Islamic history, the Basque peoples and the Asturians remained independent. The reasons for this is because of the unique geography of the land of Iberia and the natural protections given to them by large mountains that allowed the Basque and the Asturian peoples to be semi-independent and semi-isolated from the rest of the events taking place in the peninsula. By the 7th century, the Visigothic monarchy was both elective and hereditary. One of the most powerful kings of this time was named Egica, and Egica appointed his son Witiza, these are the names of the Gothic kings of that time frame, and appointed him in his lifetime so that the council would not elect somebody else, and hence Witiza did take over once Egica passed away. When Witiza tried to do the same for his son, this is when the council intervened and they said enough is enough. And another powerful person by the name of Roderick was the one who seized power in Toledo, allowing therefore a new kingdom to form or a new dynasty to come forth. However, despite gaining a small majority in the council, Roderick was highly controversial and very unpopular. In fact, many people viewed him to be a corrupt person, somebody who did not uphold justice. There are some accounts in our history books of a very prominent nobleman by the name of Count Julian of Seta, who sent his daughter to the royal court to finish her education as per custom, and according to those sources, that daughter was assaulted by King Roderick, and no justice was demonstrated. When the news became public, Count Julian, according to these sources, was the one to reach out to the Muslims in North Africa, asking them to invade so that justice could be restored. Now, it needs to be pointed out that quite a number of early historians, including Al-Waqidi and Al-Razi and others, that while they do mention that Julian contacted Tariq, they don't mention the story of the daughter and this incident. Nonetheless, the point is that even if the story of the daughter is perhaps not true or exaggerated, the fact of the matter is that Roderick was a very unpopular king, and his injustice and his high taxation and his corruption was something that caused many of the noblemen of the Iberian Peninsula to actually become enemies against their own king and to actually want outside help. This is why the Muslims were called in, because there was a lot of internal discontent. Tariq's invasion began as a local initiative, and perhaps in hindsight, one can say that he did make a mistake in that he didn't go through the typical hierarchy. Tariq ibn Ziyad did not reach out to Musa, and therefore Musa was not able to get permission from the Umayyad Caliphate. All of this would go on to prove a very, very big disaster, a very big mistake that would almost cost the two of them their lives and would spell out the end of their political careers. Because when you are an employee and when you do something like this, you need to get permission, you need to get approval. And so what Tariq did was a personal initiative, and in the Ramadan of 91 AH, Tariq sent a small exploratory force of around 400 footmen with 100 horsemen led by Tarif ibn Malik, who entered the Iberian Peninsula and was met with very little resistance. And he came back with a lot of spoils of war and with talk of an amazing land, fertile and waiting to be conquered. This is what incentivized Tariq ibn Ziyad to cross the Straits of Gibraltar. Obviously, at the time, it wasn't called Gibraltar. Jabal Tariq, the famous iconic statue, Jabal Tariq. This is when Tariq crossed over with probably around 7,000 men. Mostly they were Berbers, and after a few months another 5,000 joined him, and so a grand total of just 12,000 people. This was the initial force of Tariq ibn Ziyad when he entered the Iberian Peninsula. Many of them were Berbers, some of them were Arabs, and there was also a contingent of African soldiers as well. They first established themselves on what is now called Gibraltar, Jabal Tariq, before moving on to the city that is now called Al-Jasiras, Al-Jaziras, Al-Jazirat, Al-Jazira, Al-Jasiras, and surrounding the countryside. And this is where, according to our books of history, Count Julian, either he himself or he sent his own spies and his own people to guide Tariq ibn Ziyad throughout the way. Because one of the biggest mysteries is how this new army of Arabs entering the Iberian Peninsula managed to navigate and know so much about the internal realities. And what makes absolute sense was that they had help from the inside. And Count Julian and others is a name that frequently comes up. Hence, there is great evidence to suggest that Count Julian had a massive role to play in assisting the expedition and in giving general guidance to Muslims about what to do, where to fight, who not to fight, who to negotiate with. And that is why there were not that many battles. Yes, indeed, some battles did take place. There was the decisive battle southeast of what is now called Medinat Sidonia. And this is indeed one of the most decisive battles that took place. And it was in this battle that King Roderick himself was killed. King Roderick was fighting alongside the bulk of his army when Tariq invaded in April. And it took him a while to come down to meet Tariq. And so it was in the summer of that year, of 711, when the decisive battle took place on the 20th of July. And this is when King Roderick's forces faced the forces of Tariq ibn Ziyad. Now, the numbers of this battle are contested, and perhaps some people have said there might be 30,000 of Roderick's men. Allah knows best how many there were, but without a doubt, the men that Roderick had were far more than the men of Tariq ibn Ziyad. Yet still, Tariq ibn Ziyad had a massive victory. And in fact, one of the main reasons why this occurred was because an entire flank of Roderick's army, an entire contingent, abandoned him on the battlefield. Can you imagine? These are Visigoths, these are local Iberians, but they hated Roderick so much that when they saw the army of Muslims, at that minute they decided, you know what, we don't want to fight for this king at all. And so the Visigothic army suffered a massive defeat, and King Roderick disappears from history. In all likelihood, he died on the battlefield and his body was not discovered. And this defeat opened the way. It paved the conquest of the entire Iberian Peninsula. Shortly thereafter, the city of Cordova, was invaded and conquered directly by Tariq ibn Ziyad. It is said here that Count Julian advised Tariq to march to Toledo, the capital, and to divide his army to several different contingents to send them to other parts of Spain. And this proved to be a very effective strategy. Tariq sent someone by the name of Mughith al-Rumi to lead a force of barely 700 men against Qurtuba. Can you imagine? The famous city of Qurtuba was conquered with a very small force. They faced, yes, some resistance, but indeed, after a period of time, the city of Qurtuba actually did fall and the Muslims entered it victorious. And the Muslims then transformed the church into the famous mosque of Qurtuba. Now here, it is also mentioned that the Muslims purchased the church before they did so. And the point being that, of course, the reality is that Islamic law would not have allowed them to take over. And so they must have given some money. And the famous Qurtuba Masjid that is there, it actually is on the site of the church that used to be the main church of Qurtuba. The other districts of Malaga and Iberia also fell fairly easily at this time frame, and Tariq then marched on to Toledo, the capital. And by this time, there was hardly any resistance, as news has spread that the Muslim army was indeed a very well tested and well-tried army, and the forces of King Roderick had already split. And so Tariq took Toledo with very little resistance. Now, all of this is happening, and remember, Tariq did all of this without informing Musa. And so when all of these victories are happening, Tariq sends a letter to Musa, to his boss, to the governor. He's like, hey, Ustad, Sidi, Shaykh, Musa, listen, all this is happening, and you're going to be really happy to hear. I know you might be irritated, but guess what? I'm out of men, and I really need a lot of men. And so Tariq ibn Ziyad was forced to write to Musa, a bit late, but nonetheless explain to him what's happening and beg him for men. Explain to him that this is a new world ripe for the taking, but we need tens of thousands of men. And so Musa, although he was extremely frustrated, he was very angry, yet Musa understood this reality. And so Musa did indeed add 10, 15,000 men to the initial army, thus making the total number of Muslims that entered the Iberian Peninsula over 30,000. Still a relatively small number. And of course, as I explained, the reason why the Muslims were able to do this was because there was a lot of discontent internally in the Iberian Peninsula. So Musa ibn Nusayr himself then also landed in Iberia, in Spain, and he took on the massive city of Seville, Ishbilia. After months of resistance, eventually Ishbilia fell and Musa ibn Nusayr marched in as a conqueror. The reality is that Musa was a far more experienced general than Tariq ibn Ziyad, and Musa brought more equipment. Musa brought in siege engines, and Musa had far more expertise in how to conquer cities and manage armies. And therefore, Musa and Tariq together, the both of them, within the span of a few years, they managed to conquer the bulk of the Iberian Peninsula. Now, one of the really interesting treaties that we need to just highlight because it illustrates the reality of Muslim conquest is the Treaty of Theodemir. This treaty is highly significant because it establishes the first treaty between Christians and Muslims in Europe. This is 1,200 years before the first democracies, before the first notions of secularism and pluralism. What is this treaty? Musa ibn Nusayr, he sent his son Abdul Aziz into the east. And there his son met one of the senior noblemen, the Duke of Murcia, and his name was Theodemir. And Abdul Aziz made a treaty with Theodemir, hence it is called the Treaty of Theodemir, allowing them full local autonomy and full freedom of worship in exchange for a very small token tribute. In other words, the Muslims allowed the Christians semi-autonomous, in fact, fully autonomous rule. The Muslims allowed the Christians complete freedom to do whatever they want and just nominally be a part of the greater Muslim empire. And hence, Theodemir was recognized by the Muslims as the ruler of 7 cities across the Iberian Peninsula, and Theodemir would retain his own administration and he would retain his own government and simply pay an annual jizya, a whopping sum of, I kid you not, 1 gold coin. That's all he had to pay to the Muslims. 1 gold coin, a token amount. You will pay this and you are effectively your own king, your own boss. We have nothing to do with your people. And you also have to give your people as well their rights, their food. You have to take care of your people as well. And you will be in charge of your own civilization. Now, this shows that the Muslims really, their primary goal was not money. It was not financial incentive. It really was to spread Darul Islam. And of course, this is how actually Islam did spread, because what happened was the very people that Theodemir was ruling over within 200, 300, 400 years, many of them willingly, organically converted to Islam. And by signing this treaty, Theodemir ensured that none of his people would be killed or enslaved, that they would have their properties, they would have their families, they would be allowed to freely practice their religion and no damage to their churches. This treaty really shows the aims of the early Muslim empire. The aims of Musa ibn Nusayr were to cooperate with the indigenous population and not to be a tyrannical, coercive ruler. This way, every single important city only required a small garrison, and therefore the Muslims were able to run an entire empire because they effectively subcontracted rule to the locals. However, because Islam is so pure, because Islam is so organic, when people look at it, slowly but surely interacting with the Muslims, the local Iberians continued to embrace Islam until eventually, in 200 years, Islam became the dominant majority of the Iberian Peninsula. Let's return back to Tariq ibn Ziyad now. Tariq being the younger person, Tariq being the person who was less seasoned, he actually, generally speaking, favored demolishing the entire Visigothic system and replacing it with permanent settlements for his own peoples, for the Berbers. And this is something that Musa himself, that was not something that he wanted to do. As somebody who was double, triple the age of Tariq, more seasoned than him, more wise than him, a statesman, a ruler, a politician, that was a different policy. And so Tariq and Musa, the both of them, they were at odds in this regard. And of course, they hadn't seen each other for a long time as well. And finally, when they did meet, there was some tension. Tariq met Musa in Toledo. And it is said that when Musa went up to him, he harshly admonished him in front of everybody because Tariq had done things he shouldn't have done. Remember that you are the subordinate. You're not supposed to be entering a new country, doing all of this without getting prior permission. Nonetheless, they did patch things up very quickly and they then united forces, and this really helped again in the conquest. In the spring of 714, they campaigned and subjugated the Galicia valleys and other regions of Andalusia, and an ambassador was sent from Tariq and Musa to the Caliphate, to Damascus, to give the Khalifa Al-Walid a report of the conquest. Now remember, Al-Walid's permission was not sought, and so they had to placate the Khalifa. They sent lots of gifts, they sent lots of tribute, and they talked about their exploits and the conquest of Andalusia. Nonetheless, in September 714, they were summoned by the Khalifa, and the Khalifa was apparently not happy with them. Why is this the case? There are a lot of reasons given, and this is something that, again, it is well understood in early Islam, that there was at times tensions between the various political players, and there were multiple things at stake here. Of them is the fear of these types of principalities breaking away and forming semi-independent kingdoms, because this is a pre-modern world, and the Khalifa in Damascus is well aware that he does not have direct control over a land as far away as Spain, as Andalusia, as Iberia. And if Tariq or Musa had so desired, they could have easily formed their own principality, their own dynasty, and cut off from the Umayyads and brought a lot of distress, because that is exactly what had happened in so many other places and cases. And so, in all likelihood, the main concern that the Khalifa had was this concern of potential breaking away and exploitation, and he needed to make examples of these two. And so they were summoned back to the court, and they immediately dropped all of their conquests. And it's very sad, because had they continued, in all likelihood, the conquest would have continued all the way to Paris and beyond. And of course, the famous, Battle of Tours took place in the next decade. Tariq and Musa were not there when the Battle of Tours took place, but it's literally 20 years after this incident. The same generation, in all likelihood, Tariq was alive when the Battle of Tours takes place, but neither Tariq ibn Ziyad nor Musa ibn Nusayr participated in this battle. Why? Because the Khalifa had called them back. The Khalifa had insisted right then and there, drop everything that you're doing and come back to Damascus. And so Musa ibn Nusayr put his son Abdul Aziz in charge, and Musa and Tariq, the both of them, left to Damascus, thinking that they'd be back very soon. Neither of them ever came back. The biggest generals, the biggest warriors, the biggest governors, the ones who opened up the door to Andalusia, when they were called back to the Umayyad Caliphate, neither of them played any role after this reality. By the time they got back to Damascus, the Khalifa Al-Walid ibn Abdul Malik was very ill. In fact, it was said he was on his deathbed. And his next of kin was Sulaiman. And when he heard that Musa and Tariq were coming and they were about to reach Damascus, Sulaiman sent a messenger before they arrived into the city. And he said to them, "Look, stall, delay, wait, allow my brother to die, let me take charge, and then I will deal with you in my time frame." And Allah knows what would have happened if they followed, because again, all of this is mystery. What was the niyyah? Why was he doing this? Some say that Sulaiman wanted to take credit for what's happening in Andalusia himself. Whatever the case might be, Musa ignored the request. Why? Because his boss was Walid, not Sulaiman. The person he appointed, the person that he reported to, was Al-Walid ibn Abdul Malik. And he felt a sense of loyalty. I need to go back to Al-Walid. So he ignored what Sulaiman did, and he entered the city while Walid was on his deathbed. And Walid, even though he was very sick, yet he was able to express his strong displeasure. He was very unhappy at Musa ibn Nusayr for taking his own policy too far for the invasion of Andalusia and for not getting permission from the Khalifa for all that he had done. And we don't know exactly what happened, because both Tariq ibn Ziyad and Musa ibn Nusayr, their names simply vanish from the history books. Some say that Musa passed away en route to Hajj, going as a pilgrim. And as for Tariq ibn Ziyad, we literally have no idea what happened to him. It is as if the books of history erased his name. And this is the sad reality that we need to understand, that our religion is divine, our history is very human. Tariq and Musa are universally respected and admired by the Ummah. Yet the Umayyad Caliphate did not respect them, did not give them their due, was extremely unhappy at them. And the two of them were essentially, some say that they were punished and tortured, but the reality is that there's no evidence for this. But it does seem like they were stripped of their ranks, and they simply had no political role to play in the history of Andalusia after this point in time. When Walid died, 2 months later, his brother Suleiman immediately replaced the older governor of North Africa with one of his own entourage, and the new governor badly treated the remaining relatives of Musa ibn Nusayr. And in fact, Musa's son Abdul Aziz was assassinated, and it was this new governor and his policies that were blamed for the assassination. And both Musa and Tariq then went into obscurity. Of course, this isn't the end of the conquest of Iberia. Rather, it is the beginning of the conquest of Andalusia. And although the stage had been set, it would take another few decades for the Muslims to carve out what we now called Andalusia. And at one point in time, the Muslims made their way all the way up north. They crossed over into what is now today France, and they made their way to Tours or Poitiers, which is 1 hour away from the city of Paris. That was the very northernmost point that they managed to get, and then they were repelled back, and eventually the Muslims established what we now know as the Andalusian Iberian Peninsula, including Toledo, including Madrid. Madrid was under Muslim control. They called it Majrid. In fact, the name Madrid, in all likelihood, also comes from the Arabic Majrid or Majra, in which there was water flowing in certain canals, and so it was called Majra or Majrid, and from this we get the term Madrid. And so all of this conquest of the Iberian Peninsula, it took place after Musa and Tariq had left. They were the ones who led the foundations, and Qurtuba became the capital of the Muslim rule in Spain. They did not want it to be Toledo, because Toledo, Toledo, was still very influenced by the elite, by the aristocracy. So they wanted a new capital, and that was the capital that they did in Qurtuba. It was also at this stage where intermarriage begins. And so Musa ibn Nusayr, his son Abdul Aziz, actually ended up marrying one of the daughters of King Roderick. And remember our guy, King Watiza, who started all of this? King Watiza's granddaughter, Sarah, married one of the Arab noblemen, and one of her descendants was one of the most, in fact, the most famous early Umayyad Andalusian historian. His name is Ibn al-Qutiyya. Ibn al-Qutiyya means the son of the Visigoth, the son of the Gothic, the son of the Visigoth, because his great-great-great-grandmother was actually the granddaughter of King Watiza. But he was through and through Arab. He's an Umawi, and he's writing one of the chronicles of early Andalusian history. And this shows you the reality of Andalusian Islam, in which you have Arab and European blood completely intermingling together. Many of these people, they actually were fully European in their looks and in their outward appearances because of their mother's side, and yet they're speaking Arabic and they're going through the training because they're coming fully from the Islamic paradigm. It was at this time as well where the cities that we now know as being iconic for Andalusian Islam, cities like Qurtuba, cities like Granada, cities like Sevilla, Ishbilia, all of these cities are established, and many of the Arabs settled in these cities. Most of them were from the Yemeni tribes, the Lakhmids and the Judhamis. These were tribes that they lived in southern Palestine and Jordan, and many of them had come from Yemen, and then through Jordan they made their way all the way to the Iberian Peninsula. And when they made their way to that peninsula, they took with them the motifs, the plants, the culture of the Umayyad heritage in Sham. And in fact, they even imported specific trees, specific plants from Bilad Sham to plant them in the Andalusian peninsula. And as for the Berbers, the tens of thousands of Berbers that came, the Berbers were widely settled throughout much of Andalusia, primarily given pastoral responsibilities and becoming farmers to a very fertile ground in the land of Andalus. This episode of our Islamic history has so many morals and lessons for us to benefit from. Of them is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala elevates whomever He wills, regardless of lineage. Tariq ibn Ziyad was a young Berber, a former Mawla, not even from any of the elite families, not Qurashi, not even Arab, and yet he was placed in charge over Musa ibn Nusayr's own sons. And this reflects the prophetic principle that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in the Quran, Inna akramakum indallahi atqakum. The most noble of you in the sight of Allah are the most righteous. Leadership is not meant to be inherited based upon blood. Rather, it is earned via trust and competence. And when the ummah honors merit over ethnicity, Allah places barakah in its effort. Another lesson we learn is that internal corruption invites external collapse. Andalus, Spain, did not fall because the Muslims were superhuman, because the Muslims were invincible. It fell because the Visigothic system was completely fractured. The nobles hated their king, the armies lacked loyalty, justice had eroded, the population felt no reason to defend the state. And this mirrors a repeated Quranic pattern. Inna Allah la yughayru ma biqawmin hatta yughayru ma bi anfusihim. Allah does not change the condition of a people until they change what is in themselves. One of the most uncomfortable lessons of history is this: external defeat often follows internal decay. When the decay is internal, then the collapse will be external. Of the lessons we learn as well is that Islam spreads through justice as much as it spreads through power. The Treaty of Theodemir is one of the most powerful lessons in this story. The Muslims allowed full religious freedom. They allowed preservation of property and families. They respected local governments and nobility. They required only a very modest tribute. And this is why the resistance collapsed. The fact of the matter is that the average Iberian Roman citizen preferred the rule of the Umayyads, the rule of the Muslims, over the rule of the Visigothic kingdoms of old. This lesson is very clear. Islamic governance succeeds when it relieves people of oppression, not when it replaces one tyranny with another. A bitter lesson that we learn is that worldly victory does not guarantee personal honor. Perhaps the most sobering lesson comes at the end. Tariq ibn Ziyad opened the doors for Europe. He conquered an entire continent. He changed the course of world history. One of the most iconic places in the world is named after him, Jabal Tariq, Gibraltar. And yet, he died in obscurity. His boss, Musa ibn Nusayr, lived an entire life of dignity and conquest. He built not one, several empires by all of his military feats and conquests throughout all of North Africa. And yet, at the end of his life, for relatively petty reasons, he was disgraced politically by his rulers and elites. And this reminds us exactly of the prophetic warning, where the Prophet ﷺ is reported to have said, "Ad-dunya mal'unatun mal'unun ma fiha." This whole world is accursed and all that it is in it, except for the remembrance of Allah and all that is around the remembrance of Allah. Victory in this world is not the measure of success. Sincerity is. Allah may use someone to change history and still test them afterwards with humility, obscurity, death, or loss. All of this is irrelevant. If your niyyah was pure, if you had the right intentions, that is what Allah will bless and reward. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us all sincere intentions and make us of the victorious on the Day of Judgment.